Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and returning to the show, the analytics legend Aaron Schatz. Now, FTN Fantasy is where DVOA is housed. You probably knew it from Football Outsiders for many years, and you've also made many appearances on shows of mine, Aaron. And here's the thing. Here's what I need to know. I need to understand exactly what it means for the Vikings to now be the 5 seed at 14-3 and what their odds really are. So that's why you're here. What's going on, Aaron?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Better than the Vikings are this week, but I feel like this game is a little overstated because they're not going to have that much trouble in the red zone again in the future. Like that is just not something that tends to be duplicated. But our stats overall on them are down over the last few weeks. So I'm sort of like half optimistic for the Vikings and half pessimistic for the Vikings. I'm sort of caught in between.
Well, why don't we talk about the DVOA journey? Because it's a stat that I use on the show pretty frequently to cross check ourselves on how well we think the Vikings are doing. And that's really why you invented DVOA, was to tell us like what's really going on with the team and kind of get rid of some of the noise, right? So I think early in the season, we were trying to say, like, are they really like 5-0? Are they really that good? And they shot all the way up to the top. Tell me where they've gone recently. You mentioned starting to slip back. I would imagine that's the case when you lose 31-9, but explain kind of the trend of where you've seen them go with the DVOA.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear that Viking fans have had that this is just 2022 all over again. And it's not. And yet at the same time, they're not as good as the record would indicate. And they've faded a bit in recent weeks. So here is the complicated thing. For the season as a whole, we have the Vikings 7th and the Rams 17th. But in the weighted ratings that give more weight to more recent games, with week 18 removed for the Rams because they didn't play starters, we have the Rams 8th and the Vikings 11th. The issue is not just that the Vikings have faded in the second half of the season. The defense has faded. The offense actually played better in the second half of the season, but the defense went from stellar to good. But the Rams got better, especially if you take out like the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. Remember, the Rams started 1-4, whereas the Vikings had a couple of really big wins early on. So, like, for example, someone asked me yesterday, where do the Vikings stand all time in DVOA among 14-win teams? And the answer is they're the second lowest. And the lowest was the 2009 Colts. And the 2009 Colts are only the lowest because they sat all their starters in the last week of the season. And if you take that game out, the Vikings are the lowest 14-winning team. But like we keep saying about the Chiefs all year, that's like being the ugliest Sports Illustrated swimsuit model. Like, they're still a 14-win team, you know? And this isn't like 2 years ago. They're not like 2 years ago, they were like the most overachieving team of all time. This year, they're like a little bit overachieving. Not that much. Like, it's still a great team where with a pretty even chance of winning this game in Los Angeles. But the 5th seed is hard because it means that they have to then go on the road for 3 straight weeks, and that is hard to do.
Right. And the expected win-loss based on their point differential is more like 11-6, which would make sense. And there's no doubt that there were some games that they should have won in more impressive fashion based on their opponent. At Chicago was one of them. Probably should have blown out Tennessee by a lot more now that we know what Tennessee really is. But at the same time, I think defenses are a little bit volatile, a little bit hard to predict over an entire season. And with the offense increasing in its performance until Detroit. Now, this would have been my argument for, hey, the quarterback's playing extremely well. It's really crazy how fast things change, though, Aaron, because against Green Bay, Sam Darnold just couldn't have played better. 377 yards, 3 touchdowns, offense flying up and down the field. And then against Detroit, it was like they got hit by a hammer there in that game by the crowd, the atmosphere, the red zone misses. That there's 4 trips in the red zone. Each one of them has a miss by about that much. It was just one of those games. How much does that weigh on where they rank in DVOA?
I mean, it ranks. It's a heavy game. It's their worst game of the season. Even if you adjust for opponent, right? Obviously, that was the hardest opponent of the season. Even if you adjust for that, it's their lowest game of the season by DVOA. But don't read too much into one game. Like, here's something I feel like in the second half of the season that they did a better job of discovering the other receivers who aren't Justin Jefferson. Not just Addison, Hawkinson, but Naylor. Now you go back to the week 8 game with the Rams, right? Jefferson had 115 yards. The other Vikings receivers combined had 125 yards. So if we've learned anything from their offense over the last 2 months, you would not expect Monday night's game to be like that, because they've done a better job now of getting the other receivers open and finding the other receivers. Especially, I think, the improvement in using Naylor over the second half of the season.
The one thing that's hard for me to figure out, Aaron, with this team is the offensive line and pass protection, because talk about week to week against Green Bay, we spent a whole week talking about like, man, wow, they have figured some stuff out. They just shut down Green Bay's pass rush. Sam Darnold had a bunch of clean pockets back there, was looking great. And then against Detroit, they had every answer under the sun to get to the quarterback. And it's not like that was score affected for most of the game, because it was close until the middle of the third quarter. And yet they were getting to him in the red zone, getting to him on the play actions and things like that. And I think I've never really felt like offensive line play was an up and down or week to week thing. I thought usually we go into
No,
a
it's
game.
more consistent. I'm with you on that. Absolutely.
Right. And yet this was not consistent, and now they're facing a really good Rams defensive line. So I'm not sure what I'm supposed to think here, because I if the season had ended against Green Bay, the old school 16 games, we would have gone into Los Angeles saying, well, this team could pass protect against anybody. But now after Detroit, I'm going, now I don't know.
It's always been that the interior is not as good as the exterior. You follow the Vikings more than I do, certainly. How has Cam Robinson been for the season, right? I mean, we know O'Neal is good, but Cam Robinson was not. No one, when he was with the Jaguars, no one was like, that's one of the better left tackles of the league. Like, so how has he been with the Vikings overall? Because I've really only seen a couple of games.
I think that he has been in some games really excellent, in most games serviceable, to the point where you don't just have to have Josh Oliver playing over there the whole game. And there's been maybe 2 games where he's been well below average. And of course, one of them happened against the Detroit Lions. And this is, to me, this is what an average tackle is. The Vikings just haven't had one in a while because of Christian Darrisaw.
They may need to use Oliver a lot Monday night, because Jared versus Brandon Thorne's true pressure rate, where he measures like easy pressures versus harder pressures, has Jared Verse third in the league this year. Now, here's an interesting thing I will say about Jared Verse. Jared Verse had a ton of broken tackles, according to FTN data charting. It's really surprising. Like, he's an amazing pass rusher, but he was like second or third in the league in broken tackles, which you do not get out of an edge rusher. So maybe you want to run at him. But as far as pass pressure goes, he had an awesome rookie season.
And the problem the Vikings have faced in the second half is that they can't really run the ball consistently, especially to the left side, because where Cam Robinson is an average to above average pass blocker, he is a well below average run blocker. And their left guard has never started in the league before, and I think has become fatigued as the season has gone along.
Well,
And
so
he's
much
not
for that idea then.
right. Yeah, he's not getting a lot. No, I mean, this is when we talk about the Vikings being a flawed 14-3 team. I mean, they are really good, but losing Darrisaw does have its effects, and one of them is being able to run consistently. So there's another question for you. We always, folks like you and I, have always kind of looked at the run game as, well, you'd love to have it, but it's definitely more important what you do in the pass. But if you don't really have it at all to be able to lean on, I think that could be a
You end up in
problem
a
for the
lot of
Vikings.
second and eights. Yeah,
Right. Folks, it's a wonderful time of year in football, and there's a perfect dad hack that I want to tell you about that will get your kid to love Minnesota football the way that you do. It is called Future Fan Sports. At Christmas time, I gave this to one of my friends, and it worked like a charm. Future Fans helps little kids become big football fans by embedding the rules of football into parallel games and activities that make it very easy for a kid to understand. You get a box full of different games and a playbook that guides you along. For example, instead of trying to explain downs, they have a beanbag toss game with things like 4 tries or 6 points for a touchdown. All those things connect to a storybook that guides the entire future fan experience. The playbook also has lots of different mini games like word searches and bingo, where you check off all the different things that happen in a football game. It's only $49.99 at futurefans.com, and you can use the code PURPLE to get 10% off. That's futurefans.com, code PURPLE, and unlock a lifetime of memories together.
Look, the funny thing about arguments about offense versus defense and passing versus rushing is that the best thing is balance, right? I am a Patriots fan, so I come from the school of Belichick. And the school of Belichick says, do everything at least a B level so that whatever the other team can't stop, that's what you attack, is better than I can do this at an A level and this at a D level. Right? So the best thing is balance. And that, right now they don't seem to have it.
Right, which I think does hurt their chances of going deep in the playoffs, but I don't think that it ruins them. Running is another thing that, if Aaron Jones has a big game, somebody last week breaks a 58-yard run, normally that results in you getting a touchdown in the red zone, but it did not in that game against Detroit. That could be a little bit on the inconsistent side as well. With Sam Darnold, what do the numbers say about his season? Because everything that I've looked at this year, to me, puts him in just one tier below the truly elite of the elite quarterbacks. Of course, Detroit's going to hurt his overall numbers, but he still finishes with 102.5 quarterback rating for the season. And I think that pretty well sums up how he's played. Not perfectly, but just not Burrow, not Allen, not Jackson, but right behind that. That's where I would have him for the season. Where would you have him?
I wouldn't have him that high. I guess it depends how many people you think are in each tier. But we had the Vikings offense 12th in pass DVOA, and I think Darnold individually comes out around 12th. So is that second tier? Is that the bottom of the second tier? Is that the start of the third tier? What it is it's above average, which is, I think, a lot better than anybody would have ever expected from Darnold before the season began. And it's good enough that with that defense, if that defense plays closer to what it was in the first half of the year, that's good enough to make a run. I keep talking about a Big Seven. And even though the Vikings have faded a little bit in last couple weeks, I still think of the Vikings as part of the Big Seven. In my mind, there are 7 real Super Bowl contenders, and the Vikings are one of them. Ravens, Chiefs, Bills, and then the Lions, the Packers. The Lions, the Packers, the Vikings, and the Eagles. Not in that order.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And I was looking at just the odds in the gambling world and things like that. Kind of funny that their over under was 6.5 to start the season, and now they're 5th or 6th in terms of Super Bowl odds going into the playoffs. Didn't see that coming. But when it comes to comparing them to these other teams, I have long thought about this team that there's nobody that they would go against where I would say they have no chance. And that still includes the Detroit Lions, because I think if you play that game 1,000 times, most of the time they get at least a couple of touchdowns there in the red zone, and that
Yes.
game's going back and forth. It was just a weird football game, and it happened in front of 28 million people at the worst possible time. But I still think that they can play with them. Philadelphia is not a perfect team. I'm curious what you think of their passing game, because I haven't been that impressed by it this season. And everybody else is sort of in the same bucket with them in the NFC.
Dan Campbell himself said at the end of the game, "We'll see you in 2 weeks." Now, I happen to think that there's a good chance that you won't, because I think the Commanders are better than the Buccaneers. That has nothing to do with whether the Vikings win Monday night, but if the Commanders win, 6 goes to 1, not 5. The Eagles are interesting because we just ran this article on FTN that we do every year. We did every year on the old site, called the Joe Thomas Draft, which is what if every playoff team could pick a player off one of the non-playoff teams' rosters? And when we got to the Eagles, Brian Knowles, who wrote it, had a hard time figuring out who to pick, because the Eagles are kind of a be everywhere team. Not on defense. On defense, they're like A. But on offense, right, they've got the running game. They have the great offensive line. We can argue about how good Saquon really was this year, but they've got the great offensive line. They've got the 2 killer receivers. They've got a good tight end. They've got a good, not a great, but a good quarterback. So, I mean, the Eagles, I still feel like with the injuries in Detroit, the Eagles are the favorite to make it out of the NFC at this point. I would rather see Detroit or Minnesota do it, because I want to see one of those fan bases get a Super Bowl. But nothing against the Eagles, but they had one a few years ago. But the Eagles are a very strong all-around team.
I think if you did say something against the Eagles on this particular show, it would go over fine with the fan base. But
I'm not rooting. See, I'm not rooting against the fan bases, but my general rule, and I know this sounds weird coming from a Patriots fan, because God, we went back over and over and over again. But I like when teams that haven't been there in a while or ever get there. Right. So, I've been talking all about a Detroit Buffalo Super Bowl, but a Minnesota Buffalo Super Bowl would be pretty fun too.
It most certainly would. And the joke around here is that if it was Buffalo, Minnesota, then a black hole enters as someone's going to kick the game-winning field goal, and we all get sucked into it, and that's the end of the earth.
Actually, what the truth is if it's Buffalo's Minnesota, then we've learned the lesson that the 5th time is the charm.
Oh, yeah. No, that is true. That's true. Let's go back to this matchup in particular, the Vikings and Rams. I want to know what you think of their offensive side, because when the Vikings went out to play the Rams the last time, they were not aware that Puka Nacua was going to play. And Brian Flores even told us that they found out a couple hours before the game. So they had done a week of practice, a week of game planning, and then, what do you mean Puka Nacua is going to play? Because he didn't practice the whole week. And not only was he going to play, he was going to get the ball on every play against the Vikings. Well, this week they will have an opportunity to, game plan for the best player on the other team. Still, with both of those receivers in the lineup, they're pretty nasty. And I think the Rams have a lot of things that they do well that the Vikings struggle with. A veteran quarterback who can pick through the blitzes. He'll get rid of the football quickly these days, unlike back in the day when he used to get sacked a lot. I think he has 28 sacks for the season, so Stafford's not taking the hits that he used to. I look at them as being pretty dangerous on offense.
Can you guess the best quarterback in the league this year by DVOA against the blitz? Let's say minimum 50 pass attempts.
Is it Matthew Stafford?
No, it's actually Aiden O'Connell, which is crazy. But if you change it to 100 pass attempts, it is Matthew Stafford. And the best receiver in the league in yards per route run on blitzes was Puka Nacua. So this is the problem, right? Like, go back and watch that game from week 8. Blitz, ball out quick, Puka Nacua. Play the game on Monday night. If this is Brian Flores' he has to decide who he wants to be. Does he want to be Belichick or does he want to be Pete Carroll? Right? The Pete Carroll philosophy is you do what you do well and you challenge the other team to beat it. And if that's your philosophy, and that was Detroit's philosophy this week, by the way, you come out and you play blitzing and you blitz and you're like, this is what we do well. Go ahead. Stop Van Ginkel. Stop, Greenard, go ahead, do it. Or do you do the Belichick thing, which is we attack what you don't do well, in which case Flores changes the way he plays defense, and they do not blitz. And they play more man coverage, where the Vikings were very good this year, even though they were a primarily zone team, very good in man. And Stafford was 21st first in DVOA against man, although I will admit that when I looked that up, I didn't filter out the non-Puka Nacua and Cup weeks, which you really need to do to really look at Stafford. But Byron Murphy, like, okay, so when I was figuring out my all-pro team, I looked at my coverage DVOA, and Murphy was like fifth or something this year. And Coach A, I don't remember his real name, on Twitter was like, you should look at guys using just man coverage, right? Because zone is a little bit of a crutch, right? If you really want to find out the best corner. And so I thought, okay, well, the Vikings played more zone than man. When I filter by only man, Murphy's going to go down. Nope, Murphy was the best in the league in man coverage this year.
Wow.
So they want to, I think, switch up what they do, which is instead of zone blitzing, play man and rush only 4 and stay on those guys with like a rover, where Nakua is going to come over the middle. There's going to be lots of crossing routes and stuff. Do like a cover 1 rover with man coverage. And I think that is much more of an attack on what Stafford doesn't do as well.
I think that you are barking up the right analytic tree, my friend, because against the Green Bay Packers, they came out and played a lot more man than we had seen them throughout the season. And all of us just even in real time are going like, does that look
Love
like
had all kinds of problems with it, even though his DVOA against man was actually really good going into that game.
right?
So,
Because these teams are prepping for a defense that plays a lot of zone. And at some point, though, this is a question for Brian Flores, who has been a revelation with this defense. But attacking the middle of the field has been a thing that veteran quarterbacks have been really good at. Once again, Jared Goff demolished them in the middle of the field because they do vacate that area with a lot of their blitzes. Ivan Pace comes a lot, and so does Blake Cashman. They'll send Josh Metellus up the middle, and there's just space there. They may have to do something different. They may have to use the edges a little more. They might have to use man coverage a little more. And as big and as awesome as Puka Nacua is, that may give them the best chance to try to actually double him the way the teams do with Justin Jefferson, because he is playing at such a high level. He's up there with the Justin Jeffersons of the world.
yes, he was in my, I have, this new thing I started doing last year, which was root DVOA. So that was DVOA where the denominator was routes instead of targets. And it's actually, unfortunately, it takes me a lot of time to put together, but it's actually more accurate. It's more consistent from year to year. It's more predictive. Nacua was the best in the league this year. So he had a phenomenal year when he was healthy. He was absolutely in the Justin Jefferson. I mean, the style-wise, he's more the Amon-Ra St. Brown camp, but he's phenomenal. He's phenomenal. But they can prepare for him this time. They know he's going to play.
Right, exactly. What about you started talking about Verse, but what about the rest of that defense? Because the D line,
Fisk also is really good,
yeah.
and Kobe Turner, but the cornerbacks are not. If you can hold up against the pressure, the cornerbacks are not great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the issue, right? For the Vikings, can they hold up? I feel like that's where this game is getting decided, don't you, Aaron? Is if they can even just give Sam Darnold a chance to get clean pockets, then they can light this team up.
Number 1 quarterback in the league in DYAR value on deep passes of 16 or more air yards was Sam Darnold. And the Rams ranked 29th against those passes. But you can only throw those passes if you can stay standing up long enough to get the receivers downfield. If they can, they will have success.
Right. Yeah, I really think if you were an old school football analyst, if Bob Trumpy was here and he was saying, Dick Enberg, this game's going to be won in the trenches. I think that there's a lot of truth to that with the Vikings offense versus the Rams defense, but not in the way that it used to mean. I want to get your opinion on the Darnold question that the entire world is asking. And should they trade KOC? No, that's a joke, but I have no idea how that came up last week. But with Darnold, yeah, that was crazy. Just out of nowhere, we're talking about trading the coach. But with Darnold, there's some options that the Vikings have to potentially deploy to keep him. They could also just entirely roll the dice and go to their young quarterback. Which way do you think that they should approach that?
As an owner of JJ McCarthy in multiple dynasty leagues, I favor letting Sam Darnold lead. No, seriously, for the first half of the year, um, I was like, look, this team is being driven by defense. Why is there so much talk about Darnold? Darnold is having a slightly below average season. It's really nice, but a lot of that is O'Connell and the receivers and everything. Okay, let him leave. The improvement in the second half of the year, even with the Detroit game, okay. I think at this point they need to franchise him. I would not sign him to a big money long-term deal. I would franchise him. I would come back and have a competition next year. And I would hope that McCarthy wins the competition.
Hmm.
If Darnold wins the competition and he comes out and has another year like this, then you sign him to a long-term deal and you trade McCarthy. But I think to trust that Darnold can do this for multiple years, you don't want to get caught in the Case Keenum situation, where Keenum had that amazing year for the Vikings that was completely out of line with the rest of his career. And then he went elsewhere the next year and turned back into a pumpkin. You don't want to sign Darnold for a bunch of money and have him turn back into a pumpkin. If you franchise him, you know you get at least one more year, and you can bring McCarthy along and have them compete with each other.
I'm curious about in terms of his season, because it sounds like DVOA is a little bit lower on it than some of the other numbers for his year, like his PFF grade or his quarterback rating, or even just touchdowns, which may be also a product of the fact they can't run in the red zone. But when it comes to this caliber of season, how often does that fall off? Because the way I was looking at it in the second half of the year was like this play seems to be pretty consistent from week to week. Again, it's not the
Yeah, I
Detroit
mean,
game.
most of the lifetime backups who have a season like this, they have a season like this on 350 passes, not on 550 passes, right? You're Josh McCown in 2013. There's a Brian Hoyer year that's really good. Something like what Keenum did in 2017 is more rare. I think it was 2017.
Mhm.
Is more rare and then turn back into a pumpkin, but it does happen. Like he's not having Lamar Jackson's leap year out there, right? Like there are plenty of quarterbacks in history who've been below average and then had a year where they were like 12th in the league. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that with a year to watch film, defenses figure out what to do with him and that he declines. And it's also not out of the realm of possibility that so much of this is about O'Connell and Jefferson and Addison and the line that McCarthy can come in and do better. I honestly don't know. And that's the problem. And that's why you want to franchise him, because you don't know.
No, you don't. And with Darnold, I do think that he possesses some things in his toolbox that fit so well with what Kevin O'Connell does. Now, that's not to say that JJ McCarthy doesn't have a great arm.
No,
He
and
does.
it's why they always talked about Darnold was one of those guys who always was talked about as would you like to see him in a Shanahan McVay type offense? And this is a McVay type, it's Kevin O'Connell worked for McVay.
Right. And being able to push the ball downfield as accurately as he has to Jefferson, to Addison, makes for a very explosive offense. And what happened in the second half of the season is he really, I think, started to capture the short passing game, where early in the year it was basically if he's not hitting deep shots, the offense is just failing. But then teams started to play way, way deep. And he started to take what was given to him underneath, and he started to get better, not against Detroit, at adjusting protections and having full command of the offense and growing to the point where I would like to see him in a second year of O'Connell's offense, especially because of what I saw in Kirk's second year in O'Connell offense, which was he was even more comfortable when he came into 2023 before his Achilles popped, but he looked like he was really getting it and mastering it. And it's complicated for these
Yes.
quarterbacks. So, which is another reason to say if McCarthy waits another year, it's not a tragedy of sports. And just to add one point to it, I think that there are enough Darnolds through history who struggled until age 27, 28 or didn't even get to start until that point and turned out to be really good, that I want to see. That's the biggest thing. I want to find out what you've really got here, which I think you can do if you keep him for at least one more year.
Yeah, I agree.
Can we run through the other playoff bracket real quick? You got
Yeah,
time?
let's do it.
I mean, this is your Aaron Schatz media tour, so I don't want to take up too
Yeah,
much of your shot.
and people should know, by the way, FTN Stats Hub is free all weekend. So go to
Oh,
the
okay,
FTNfantasy.com, and you can get all these cool stats, all the blitzing stuff, all the like man coverage stuff, all that filtering is all in there through all 18 weeks, and it's free all weekend. You should really check out what we have.
awesome.
Let's do
Okay,
a lightning tour of the rest of the playoff bracket.
yeah. So on the NFC side, you said you think Washington is going to beat Tampa Bay, huh?
I like Washington. I mean, I'd say 65%. Washington is higher in full season DVOA. They're higher in weighted DVOA, and Tampa's really had some problems the last couple of weeks passing the ball. And yeah, I like Washington.
I like Washington in that too. Real quick, if Washington wins and Philly wins, what
Then
happens to
Washington
the?
goes to Detroit.
Okay, and then the Vikings go to Philly.
Vikings would go to Philly.
Oh, oh boy, that's not great. So how about Philly and Green Bay? What do we got there?
Yeah, it's interesting because DVOA loves Green Bay's second half of the season, except for the last couple of games. But if you look at the weighted trend, they've been really good. Like they come out as the second best team in the NFC. The problem is the first best is Philadelphia. So I do like Philadelphia, but I think that's a closer game than people realize. The Packers are going to miss Christian Watson a good amount because he's so much of their deep passing game. So I do think Philadelphia is definitely favored to come out of that.
I mean, the X factor there to me is just where is Jalen Hurts in his health? They're going to
Yes,
make sure he's
I'm
back out
assuming
there.
that Jalen Hurts is healthy and ready to play. If he's not, it's a different story.
Yep, and I'm also Packers fans. I think tend to think Matt LaFleur chokes in playoff games, and I guess they've got some history with that. But I think he's a pretty good coach, so I'm curious about
Oh,
the
he's a great
coaching.
coach.
Yeah,
Matt LaFleur is a great coach. First of all, he's very aggressive on fourth downs, which analytics people like. Second of all, his ability to design an offense that worked for Malik Willis, when you compared it to the inability of Mike McDaniel to design an offense that worked for Tyler Huntley or Skylar Thompson, really stands out.
yes, definitely. Let's see, Chargers and Houston. This might be a hot take. 2 5 seeds in the Super Bowl, maybe here. I mean, I don't think that the Chargers are a Super
No,
Bowl
I
team.
don't. It would be a
But I'm
shock
intrigued.
to me. It would
I'm
be a
intrigued.
shock to me if it's not one of the top 3 seeds in the AFC.
Yes.
But none of those teams are in this game. So the Chargers are better than Houston. If you look at the 14 remaining playoff teams using weighted DVOA minus week 18 for the teams that sat starters, the 14th of 14 is Houston. Their offense has just gone from bad to worse over the course of the season. Stroud is not playing as well. The offensive line is shambles. No Tank Dell. Yeah, I think the Chargers will win that.
I think so too. I'm just intrigued by Chargers Chiefs and what that could potentially mean if the Chargers could pull something off. They always play the Chiefs really tough.
They do.
How about Pittsburgh and Baltimore? Seems almost too easy. Is it wrong to just be like, okay, Baltimore, do not mess this up?
The line is 10, and I feel like as much as my numbers are so in love with Baltimore, Baltimore for 2 straight years has been one of the best teams ever by DVOA. I do feel like these teams tend to be closer, and I feel like Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh might cover, but I do feel pretty strongly that Baltimore is going to pull out a win here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. And I feel the same way about Buffalo and Denver. I like what Denver's done this year. Most people thought they'd be like a 5 or 6 win team. And this is the evidence that if you have a Sean Payton or a Kevin O'Connell or a Jim Harbaugh, that you're likely to go the over when you have one of those great coaches in the league.
Although the
But
thing about it with Peyton is this is Peyton succeeding in a different way than he did before. This is Peyton succeeding with a defense dominated team rather
yeah,
than an offense dominated team. But here's the thing. Riley Moss comes out at the bottom of the league in charting of coverage. And it's not just my coverage stats. The stuff that Dan Pizzuta has played with at 33rd team, which is based on, I think, True Media or whatever, also has him near the bottom of the league. I don't understand the talk about him as being super awesomely important to the Denver defense. Patrick Surtain has been like, go ahead, throw on the other side. And Riley Moss has been like, not that good. So I think that Buffalo Josh Allen's it up. He runs, he scrambles, he finds whoever's not being covered by Surtain, and they're fine.
So now one more big question about this is you've mentioned you think Philadelphia's got the best chance in the NFC. How does one even go about guessing between Baltimore, Kansas City, and Buffalo?
I mean, my odds like Baltimore and Kansas City best because Kansas City has the bye, while Baltimore is the best team by DVOA, and Buffalo is somewhere in the middle. And trying to figure out just how much Kansas City has been taking their foot off the gas is very difficult. Nobody wants to pick against Kansas City. Nobody wants to be the person who, when Kansas City wins, everybody's like, how did you ever doubt Patrick Mahomes? But that defense has not been as good in the second half of the year, even though the offense is getting better. And the odds are that Kansas City will not make it. Right? I mean, the odds are that either Baltimore or Buffalo will make it over Kansas City. But the odds are that Kansas City, if you look at each team individually, Kansas City has the best odds because they're the number one seed. But it's trying to judge them this year is very difficult.
Yes, it's been quite a journey there with the opinions on Kansas City. I just feel like with Josh Allen that if you are this good for this long, you're going to make it at some point. But then
the same is true with Lamar Jackson.
Exactly. So who's going to do
those guys struggle in the playoffs until the year they just don't.
Right. Exactly. So I don't know that somebody's not getting to the AFC Championship between Lamar and Josh Allen, and that is a shame. Anyway, FTN Fantasy is where you could go to get all these great statistics that you have cited and free for the weekend. Tremendous. So, Aaron Schatz, this has been a great breakdown preview of playoff weekend. I greatly appreciate it. Maybe we'll be getting together again before the Super Bowl. And
we'll see. I mean, like I said, I do consider them a serious contender. So we'll see whether they make it all the way to New Orleans.
I do as well, but they got to prove us right in Los Angeles. So, Aaron, thanks so much. Great to get together with you again and enjoy the playoffs, my friend.
Sounds good.